Let's begin. My name is Sherry Kling, and if you don't know me, I am Director of Process and Faith, which is a program of the Center for Process Studies. We are a multi-faith network of relational spirituality. And again, as I mentioned, we are a program within the Center for Process Studies. And if you're new to us through this event, then we invite you to visit our websites and explore the various things we offer. So processandfaith.org, and I'm sure Jared will put some links in the chat as we go along, but processandfaith.org, and then the Center for Process Studies. And we typically have events like this periodically, monthly or so. Sometimes we'll have courses that we are multi-week courses. We also have learning circles. There's a Christian process explorations learning circle, a Buddhist process explorations, and book study groups. We have a lot of different ways that you can engage with these ideas and with our community. So we welcome you tonight, and we invite you to explore the other things we have going on for the future. So let me introduce our speaker, and then we can get rolling here. Dr. Patrick Mahaffey is with us this evening, and he is Professor Emeritus in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute there in Santa Barbara, California. His areas of expertise include Hindu and Buddhist traditions, comparative philosophy of religion, and contemplative yoga. And he got his PhD in religious studies from the University of California there in Santa Barbara as well. You've spent a lot of time there in Santa Barbara then, Patrick. It's a beautiful place. I can see why you maybe didn't want to leave. And I don't know if you ever had chance to cross paths with David Ray Griffin, who was a Santa Barbara resident, but of course he was one of the founders of the Center for Process Studies over 50 years ago. Unfortunately, it has now passed, but I was privileged to have lunch with him there in Santa Barbara when I went to an event at Pacifica, so it was really wonderful. So anyway, we're here tonight, Patrick, to tell us a little bit about some of the ideas in his newest book called Individuation and Beyond, Worldviews, God Images, and Self-Realization. So with that, I'll let Patrick take it away.
Thank you, Sherry, and I really appreciate your invitation to be here and all of you who are spending an hour with me here tonight. I have a great respect for Sherry, for her extraordinary book, Process Spirituality, where I get to meet her at a conference on Power in the God of Love, where we were both presenters on spirituality, and it was a book that just I thought was extraordinary, and I still think that. I think it's unprecedented, nothing like it before or since she wrote it. So, and she's just a wonderful person, and I have a great respect for process thought that dates back about 50 years, because I did a year of study at then Claremont Graduate School in the Department of Religion, now Claremont University. And during that year, I had a research assistant position in the Center for Process Studies. So that was a background that I have, and then to attend that conference a few years ago felt like a real great homecoming in a certain way. And I was so impressed by how I think this mode of thought has developed. One of my great interests has been religious pluralism, and it was evident at the time I was at Claremont that there was an openness to this, but it seems to have just expanded incredibly into what is now Process and Faith. So I think this is an organization with a mission and values that I just totally align with. So what I want to do is speak fairly briskly, because I have enthusiasm about wanting to share far more than I actually can in the time that would be allotted prior to conversation. And in a short while, I'll use screen share simply as a way of telegraphing basic ideas that are part of the ingredients of what I want to share, and those that are of interest to those of you attending. Hopefully we can explore that in greater depth, unpack the ideas. But my initial intent really is just kind of to sketch out, what I've tried to do in the book, which I would say is essentially a confessional book and a pedagogical book. And my aim is to engage, rather than persuade. So with that, I will go to screen share. and begin by saying what happens in, what's the structure of the book. Basically, it has 7 chapters, and I'm going to touch on each one of them briefly, and here you see what they are. They begin with faith and worldviews. Then the next 5 chapters are on the worldviews that are important to me, beginning with process relational theology. The final book is very practice oriented, what my mode of integrative spirituality has, what it actually looks like, what I do on a daily basis. And I'll mention briefly, I have an appendix, which is my contemplative reading list, which it's a practice among others that I've been doing for maybe 30 years now, and I've read some 250 books, and I decided to select 108 of them that I would put in the appendix. Now, the themes that I discussed in the 5 major chapters on the different worldviews include God, or God image, self, the ultimate purpose of life, what are the practices for realizing that, and then I have a section on what really still lands for me. And then so there's really 2 parts to that: what lands, what doesn't land quite so much, or that I have questions about. And that's kind of a prelude then to asking the reader, usually 5 or 6 questions, what lands for you? So in that way, that's why I say it's kind of pedagogical and engaging rather than trying to persuade a person to think a certain way. And I conclude each chapter with a list of annotated books and websites that one can look into if they're interested in pursuing some material in more depth. So the first chapter has 2 main emphases, and the first is worldviews, because essentially, the kind of question, we live in a world that's awash in worldviews, secular and religious, and some of them, as you know, are quite different and often in conflict with one another, animating, the culture wars and the polarization, that we're living with so intensely these days. Certainly no single narrative can convincingly explain the complexities of human culture and the natural world. So it's imperative, really, that we grapple with that complexity and find a vision of life that's going to work for us. And in that spirit, we could ask, as C.G. Jung did, what myth or story are we living? But put it differently, what worldview are we living? So basically, I'm here using myth and worldview somewhat interchangeably. I regard myself to be a pluralist in the sense that I think there's many worldviews that are cogent and coherent and life-enhancing, particularly with respect to what is the nature of the divine or the sacred, the psyche, and the cosmos. But I'm also an integral thinker, meaning that integral thought presupposes pluralism, acknowledging those many perspectives, but it goes beyond it by aiming to coherently connect the dots in ways that are richer and more dimensional than any one view might provide. Now, one of the ways that so let me take a moment here to say something briefly about what the functions of myth and worldviews, are. Joseph Campbell delineated 4. I think this is very helpful. He said, the primary function animating the other 3 would be what he calls the religious or transcendent function, so that we end up having some sense of what the greater totality of being is all about. That then dovetails with what is our cosmology, what is the nature of the kind of cosmos that relates to that kind of transcendent reality. There's a social function, of course, of myth, and then an often neglected view of myth is its psychological or pedagogical function, which Campbell, very much emphasized, as did Jung. Now, there's a relative correspondence between, what we might call dimensions of worldviews. My mentor, Ninian Smart, delineated 7 of them. And you'll see that one of those would be philosophical or theological, another would be narrative or mythical. But then there's the engagement of ritual, and then more specifically, practices that are more contemplative, like prayer. There's an ethical and legal dimension, and then there's the social forms in which we embody this with other people, whether it be congregations or sanghas. But a 5th dimension would be the imagery, the iconography, and also the churches and synagogues and temples in which the architecture alone encodes what the worldview would be about. So in chapter 1, the first major emphasis, and it certainly feels pertinent to the group I'm speaking to here, is what is the nature of faith? And I agree with those that would include Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Karen Armstrong, James Fowler, that it's important to really distinguish between faith, which is far richer and more personal than articles of belief. Faith is better understood as a kind of orientation that we have to ourselves, to our neighbors, and to the cosmos or the universe. It's more of an alignment of the heart and will, a commitment of loyalty and to loyalty and truth that expresses our ultimate values and concerns. And I am a developmentalist, and I think that applies to many things, including faith, and I strongly align with the work of James Fowler, who suggests in his book Stages of Faith that there are about 6 stages that begin with literal and exclusivist attitudes that increasingly move in the direction of more symbolic understandings of the self and the world that we share with others. So I think our development in terms of faith is intimately tied to worldviews. And I also am influenced by William James and his great varieties of religious experience, where he uses the term overbeliefs to encode what he means by the ideas that may not be provable, but which make all the difference in terms of how you see, think, and act in the world. And when you see, think, and act in alignment with them, the universe takes a turn for the better, and when you don't, it takes a turn for the worse. I think that pragmatic view is very true. So let me now move briefly through the 5 main chapters on the modes of thought I try to put together. And by the way, the metaphor I have for these 5 views is that of a intellectual contemplative mandala. So these, over the course of some 50 years of study, I've come to find what are the views that coherently add something to a more encompassing view that are greater than the sum of the parts. So process relational theology is the first chapter I discussed, because first and foremost, as a Western person who was confirmed in the Lutheran Church, I need a Christian worldview that I can include in my mandala, even if it isn't the primary way I might describe my spirituality, which I'll get into more a little bit later. And Jung, for example, felt like a Western person must honor the Christian inheritance that shapes your very psyche. Likewise, a Buddhist like Thich Nhat Hanh, in his wonderful books Living Christ and Living Buddha, and another one, Jesus and Buddha as Brothers, says that even if you get strongly interested in another tradition like Buddhism or some other, if you have a Christian background, Jesus is an ancestor, spiritual ancestor to which you must do homage, that you must honor in your heart and in the way you live and relate to others. I just totally agree with that. So that's why process relational theology has remained an important ingredient in the way that I think, see and act in the world. I also, among those, and this is certainly natural for people who are interested in process thought, who want a coherent cosmology. And I think Whitehead provides the most compelling Western version that I know of, as well as a panentheistic God image. There are different versions of panentheism. I'll discuss another one later when I talk about my chapter on contemplative yoga. But I think it's a profound God image. I resonate with it a great deal, and especially with the consequent nature of God, the notion that our choices and actions become integrated. That what we do in the temporal world is not lost, but what's of value is preserved. I think that is a beautiful and inspiring idea, and it's definitely one of the ingredients of what I call my mandala. And when you look at the ultimate concerns and values, what's not to like when the key values are novelty, creativity, creative advance, adventure, zest for life, beauty, truth, peace. What more could you want, from a really beautiful, inspiring, way of life? So those of you who are listening here know as much or more about processing relational thought than I do, but I just wanted to give you a sense of why it's an important ingredient of how I think and live. Now, with Jungian thought, I'm going to be particularly brief here as well, but apropos what I said about finding a place for the Christian inheritance that I have as a Western person who was raised in the Christian church, one of the key ideas among many others that I value from Jung is that his notion of individuation can be understood in many ways, and one of those is that it is a way to understand the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. So it's been rendered as continuing incarnation or incarnation for all. So basically Jung was arguing, some may disagree, that to the degree that we individuate, we are actually extending, what Jesus fulfilled in his life and modeled for us, to do in ours. Another aspect of Jungian thought, it's not found everywhere, but I resonate particularly with those thinkers, Jungian thinkers, who emphasize the importance of the divine feminine and how important it is to retrieve this. I'm only going to very briefly point out two thinkers who did this profoundly. One of them being Marion Woodman, and who particularly emphasized Sophia, but also Anne Baring in her wonderful book, The Dream of the Cosmos, puts a great emphasis on the Shekinah. And there are others as well, but this is an aspect of my chapter that I amplify because I think it's important. And then a third idea is that Jungian thought helps me engage in what I refer to as imaginal prayer, and also what particularly Hindu and Buddhist traditions refer to as deity yoga. And I'll be talking about that at the end of my talk on the last chapter about the kind of spirituality that I practice. Now, moving to a third worldview that's influential to me is the diamond approach that has been taught by A.H. Almas, originally a physicist who came to Berkeley to study there, and then felt what he was learning was insufficient. Make a very long story short, after having a near-death experience and beginning to receive teachings from various spiritual traditions, he had the first of a series of rather profound awakenings that eventually became what is called the diamond approach. And it's interesting to me with respect to depth psychology because it emphasizes the psychoanalytic schools of depth psychology rather than the Jungian and archetypal schools. Because of his own background as a Muslim from Kuwait, Muslim background anyway, it's strongly influenced by Sufism. His spiritual unfolding took the form that changed over time. And he came to refer to these experiences of, say, divine love or gnosis or non-conceptual awareness, to mention three of these. These are what he called the boundless dimensions that can open up if you work through your psychological material deeply enough. Another idea that I find very important is, for him, self-realization as it unfolds does not disavow the ego or eliminate it. It integrates it into being, and for him, and for me, I would add, that's true individuation, which he also refers to as essential identity or the pearl beyond price. The ultimate aim of human life for him is to become a complete human, which would be the integration of our psychological and spiritual aspects in an embodied relational life. Now, the next chapter, the fourth of the views that are part of my mandala, is contemplative yoga. It's the longest chapter. It's the most complex chapter because basically I took all of the themes I told you that I work on: God, self, purpose of life, practices for its realization. I actually addressed each of those themes relative to the 5 iterations of contemplative yoga you see depicted on the slide, beginning with the most ancient form in the Upanishads, that are further elaborated in the philosophical school of Advaita Vedanta, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Bhagavad Gita, both of which are basically dated at around the beginning of the Common Era. Then the non-dual Shakti Shaiva Tantra tradition, that I'll say a bit more about in a moment, basically emerges around the medieval period, and the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo is a 20th century mode of thought. Now, the thing about yogic traditions is you can align with one of them and go deeply, and that can certainly be enough. But there are thinkers like Aurobindo and others that say these yogas are complementary and can be integrated. And I think that it's more rich and dimensional, when you do that. So I want to show you a second slide on contemplative yoga. This would be the tradition that I really reside in. And why is it important to me? Well, putting it briefly, 3 points. The first is that it is a body-affirming, nature-affirming spirituality that places great emphasis on the divine feminine called Shakti in Hindu tradition. It delineates 2 stages of awakening. The first, that's always emphasized in almost any yoga tradition, would be merging with the self, whether that's called the Atman or the Purusha. But from the standpoint of this non-dual Shakti Shaiva tradition, that's stage 1. Stage 2 would be to re-engage or even merge with the world. So in other words, instead of devaluing the world is fully embraced. But the sequence of this is important, because the argument would be you need to resolve your entangled ways of relating to others in the world and work through those issues first. And then when that's possible, you could actually re-engage the senses in a very healthy, world-affirming way that become really quite explicit. It's a very aesthetic worldview and spirituality as well. In fact, one of the translations of one of the major texts of this tradition is called the Radiant Sutras, and it's just a gorgeous book. And in terms of the God image, and this is a philosophical tradition, so terms like Shiva actually refer to consciousness rather than the personified image, which would simply be a way to, relate imagistically to the divine. But there are 2 modalities of the divine. It is dipolar, you might say, to borrow a phrase from process thought. So one pole is consciousness, and it is inseparable from the creative energy, which is Shakti. They are 2 aspects of one singularity. Now, one more slide on contemplative yoga, because I think the thought of Sri Aurobindo, a great yogi and philosopher of the 20th century, is a sort of contemporary or more modern extension of the Shakta Shaiva Tantra thought, because it is a philosophy of evolution, and it characterizes emergent levels beyond the rational mind. It delineates several of those, including what's called the intuitive mind, the overmind, and the supermind. It valorizes the divine feminine, or the Shakti principle, nature in the body, just like Tantra does. And it has inspired several modes of contemporary thought, including the Esalen Institute, founded by Michael Murphy, co-founded by him, was a student of Aurobindo's thought. The California Institute of Integral Studies is actually based originally on Sri Aurobindo's thought. And then the integral philosophy, at least the version of Ken Wilber draws, was originally inspired by Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy and integral yoga. Now, moving to the last of the 5 worldviews that are ingredients of this mandala of mine, and just touching on them briefly, again, just to kind of sketch out what are some of the ideas that I find attractive and useful to include in this more encompassing way of understanding the world. It elaborates a cosmology spelled with a K. The reason why is when you spell it with a K, it's a cosmology that includes our interiority, it's not just the physical universe. And corresponding to that would be an epistemology that delineates 4 quadrants of knowing. 2 of them are interior, the individual level, The collective level would be culture, and the other two modes would be the physicality. At the level of the individual, that would be something like brain physiology. But at the level of the collective, it would be social systems and ecological systems. It delineates and valorizes that there are really three modes of how we might experience the divine. The I thou, so celebrated by Martin Buber, which is so natural to anyone who has a theistic disposition, is certainly one of them. But the I relationship would be the kind of spirituality that is engendered through deep meditative practice. And the third mode would be the I-it, would be relating to the great web of life, as another way in which the divine can be vividly experienced. It delineates psychological and spiritual forms of development, saying they're not the same. They can be complementary, but one does not take the place of the other. And emphasizes, as Jung did, the importance of shadow work and develops a specific practice for that. Delineates multiple modes of intelligence, not just cognitive, but moral, spiritual, intrapsychic, and other modes. And differentiates states of consciousness from stages. Now, one of the important things about that is he argues, and I think correctly, Wilbur I'm referring to now, that anyone might have a rather profound spiritual experience, but it's going to be interpreted through your psychosocial stage of development. So you could have even, in one of his books, he makes reference to a study of Zen masters from the 19th century who had Satori experiences, but they were all xenophobic, nationalistic, homophobic. You get the picture, So that's one of the many reasons why a differentiation of psychological development and spiritual development is important, and why I value this mode of thought. Three other points, but very briefly, again, thinking of life from a developmental standpoint, in terms of psychosocial development, he makes the argument, as do many others, including Piaget, Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan, and some others as well, that basically our development moves from egocentric concerns, me, to ethnocentric concerns, our tribe, to more world-centric concerns, and ultimately cosmocentric concerns. Now, sadly, he argues and draws on others that try to make some reasonable conjecture about this, that probably 60 to 70% of the world's population are still at egocentric and ethnocentric stages of development. And that's probably true when you think about the nature of the enduring conflicts, that are on the front page of the news every day. So I think that notion is important to think with, and it's related to the stages of faith that I talked about earlier. Another aspect of the meta theory is a spectrum of worldviews, and there's sometimes at least 6, 7, 8 of them that are delineated. The ones that are most, and there's a color scheme. Spiral dynamics introduced color into this, but basically Gebser and Aurobindo and then Wilbur, work with the notion that there's a trajectory that starts with archaic to magic to mythic literal to rational to pluralistic, and then more integral modes of understanding that enable us to go beyond polarization and dualistic modes of thinking into more systematic ways of thinking. I think that's very, very useful. Most of our culture, I would argue, not me alone, but he would argue, and many people would argue, the culture wars are really a conflict of the amber, orange, and green clashing with each other. Or putting it differently, traditionalist views, modernist views, and pluralistic, oftentimes very progressive views, but which nevertheless find it very difficult, to actually listen and have dialogue, with views that seem so objectionable, from what they understand to be maybe rightly, but also righteously, a more advanced way of thinking that isn't very helpful to building bridges. So with that being said, the last element that I find useful in integral meta theory is its practice aspect, which delineates 4 modes, as you can see here: body, mind, shadow, and spirit. The best articulation of that with many practices is the source you see listed there below, written by Wilbur and several collaborators. And I'll use that as a segue to talk a bit about myself. I also, not necessarily, it wasn't an idea I really came to from integral thought, but I came to see that basically there are 4 modalities or components rather, of what I do in my own practice. And they're slightly different because I use the category of soul to include shadow work, as well as emotional or affective and relational ways of engaging spiritual life. The book delineates many of those practices, and I want to just very briefly, give you a sense of a few of them that belong to each of these 4, just touching on them briefly. So I begin a day with ritually attuning to what I call the suchness of things, with the breath and with bowing. There's a lovely practice from that Integral Life Practice book that illustrates how one might do that. You're essentially breathing down the source and the light of consciousness into your body, and then into the fullness of your body and the fullness of life, and then breathing out and returning to the light, doing that several times, bowing to the different directions with intention that your life, that your work, that your actions, will be in line with supporting consciousness and the growth of others. I do simple yoga postures, nothing fancy, including 2 yin yoga classes, which are mostly just sitting, mostly on the ground, and they're very meditative because you hold the poses for quite a while. But they're simple, and they just make you more embodied, and walking, and sometimes including mantra practice while walking. At the level of the soul, gradually over time, I just evolved a kind of practice where I have an altar, what Hindus would call a puja, and I light a candle on it. I cut a flower from the yard, I place a piece of fruit on it, and I wave that in front of what's on that altar. Journaling is a major part of my spiritual practice. I do that every morning, starting with dream work if I can remember a dream. It's also my way of doing shadow work. Self-inquiry is a practice I learned a few years ago while on a retreat. And it's extremely simple, but it's getting in the habit of basically asking yourself in any given situation, what's your present feeling? Are you sad? Are you angry? Are you happy? Are you depressed? And just acknowledging this to yourself prevents the accumulation of a lot of repressed and disavowed emotion. There's more sophisticated versions of that, but it's actually also right at the beginning of my journal practice every day. I want to say, okay, what's my A statements? That's the short form of talking about accurate statements of present feeling. Now, more relationally, my wife and I have engaged in the Native American practice of simply taking turns listening to one another without any interruption for whatever period of time we have available to us. Could be 20 minutes, half hour, could be longer. And it's the whole point is listen. I like to think of it as relational yoga. Of course, it can be done with colleagues, it could be done with friends, with siblings, with children. It's a great way to cultivate relational connection. And then I think spiritual friendship, whatever form that takes, is really essential to spirituality. And I have spiritual friends. I have belonged to yogic sangha communities, and those are the key factors that comprise the soul dimension. For mind, I referred to contemplative reading, and that's also how I begin a day, actually prior to prayer and meditation, and the study of theological, philosophical, psychological texts. I think of that as a more academic endeavor, but complementary to contemplative reading, because contemplative reading has to nourish not just the mind, it has to nourish the mind, the heart, as much of you as possible, in my view. And then finally, the spiritual dimension, I mentioned imaginal prayer. And it occurred to me, when I first started working at Pacifica about 35 years ago, I would have to say I didn't have a very active prayer life for maybe a decade or so, and I thought to myself, can I still do that? And I thought, well, I guess I should experiment with it, and give it a go. So I began that process, and I thought it might be awkward, but it wasn't awkward for long. I think less than a week into it, I felt like I was really connecting with something, and it's just evolved into what I call a kind of internal liturgy. That is a prayer that I make every morning before meditating. And it ultimately later became conjoined with what I referred to earlier as deity yoga. And the briefest way I can describe that would be, and in my case, I'll show you an image first. So this is an image of the Hindu goddess Saraswati. And we could think of her as the Hindu version of Sophia, or the Jewish Shekinah. She's a goddess of wisdom, but also of language. She's also associated with the arts, the humanities, hence the instrument you see her playing. So one of the practices I was initiated in some years ago was to imagine her over my head right before I meditate. And I'm not particularly visual, I have to say, and it's useful maybe to know that in case you're not a visualizer. But basically you're imagining this presence of wisdom, benevolent wisdom, that is going to pour into your crown and drop down and nourish your body. Now, it wouldn't have to be Saraswati. It could be Jesus. It could be Tara from the Buddhist tradition. It could be any number of figures, but that's what I refer to as deity yoga, and it really has become the sort of entry point, to my daily meditation. So the other element that I'll refer to, among other practices, these are the two key ones, is mantra meditation. That's been my preferred mode for mainly 50 years. I happen to use a Hindu mantra, which is Om Namah Shivaya, which is typically translated as reverence to the self. You'll notice a syllable there in square brackets, pronounced reem. That's what's called a bija, or seed mantra in Hindu tradition, and it's a feminine energy. So it actually makes the particular mantra, a conjoined masculine feminine mantra with respect to it when you're thinking of it in a personified way. But alternatively, I am, could be used as a mantra. Or, there's a lovely book by a Indian yogi, Russell Paul. He grew up in a Christian family in India, and actually spent many years with Bede Griffiths in that Hindu Christian monastery in India. And in his book, Jesus in the Lotus, the mystical doorway between Christianity and yoga spirituality, when he's talking about mantra, he says, well, one possibility among others is a Christian mantra called Christaya, Chritaa, which he renders as I bow to the Christ, or to the Anointed One. What I would like to say from many, many years of practicing meditation is, it doesn't need to be elaborate. Simple is actually better. And in fact, I must say, the centering prayer of Thomas Keating, if I'd known about that maybe 50 years ago, that may have been the mode of meditation I would have taken on. I have tremendous respect for it. But there's a lot of similarities, and the key thing here is don't repress your thoughts or sensations or feelings, but simply favor the mantra, whether it's something like Om Namah Shivaya, or even I am can be used as a mantra. Just give it more attention, favor it. And then something I didn't learn until maybe 5-6 years ago is ideally lay down in what Hatha Yoga calls Shavasana, or corpse pose, for 5 minutes, to let the whole process of your meditation, however long it was, be assimilated and metabolized, and before you transition and move into your day, whatever it is you're going to be doing. And not only do you metabolize, there's a greater likelihood that you'll carry what you had generated in that meditation or experienced in that meditation into your interactions with others. So I want to just call out two books very, very quickly. My favorite books on meditation would be Sally Kempton's Meditation for the Love of It, and a short little book that actually uses I Am as a mantra by Yogani called Deep Meditation, just 100 pages. They're both very beautiful, very lucid, clear books, very different flavor, but my two favorites of all time. Now, I'd like to close my presentation inviting you to engage in a very brief contemplative experience. The image you're seeing right here is a mandala that Jung painted that's in his Red Book called Window into Eternity. And what I would like you to do is initially just kind of look at it with soft gaze. Let your attention kind of be drawn into it. Just for maybe half a minute or so, just sort of open to it. And now close your eyes. And I want you to ask yourself a question very gently. What am I? Not who am I, but what am I? Ask it maybe 3 times with a pause of 50 or 20 seconds between each time. And I'm presenting this as a sort of portal to what Zen tradition would call your original face before your parents were born. Let it be an image that might take you into the beyond within yourself. And we'll end this when you hear me ring a bell. Well, I really thank you for your attention, and would like to engage you with, as best I can, with any questions or comments you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patrick. That was really wonderful. A really nice survey of everything that's in your text, which is a great book. I just finished it myself and really very much enjoyed it. I did a little bit of, when I was at Claremont, we had to do in my program a little bit of interreligious study. And so I did a little bit of study of Sufism, which I really resonate with. And also I did a little study of Hinduism, and I took 2 classes, one in the Bhagavad Gita and one in the Divine Feminine in Hinduism, and really enjoyed both of them very much. And I love the philosophy that I've read in Hinduism quite a lot. So I appreciated your diving into those. And I was completely unfamiliar with the diamond approach, and knew a little bit about integral stuff, but again, not a detailed level. So I appreciated what you did in the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And I agree with you. One of the when you talk in each section about kind of what still resonated with you with the worldview or the system you were looking at, and then maybe what limitations you saw. So you had some limitations that you talked about in process relational thought. And then I wanted to mention, I'll put in the chat, Jay McDaniel recently wrote a blog on his Open Horizons, where he talked about Patrick's book and the limitations, or maybe, things that were not as satisfying to Patrick about process relational thought. And then Jay added some of his own areas that he thought could use some work or on them as well. And that missing of the divine feminine is an area that I agree with very much. Although I did find in This is maybe a bit of a stretch, but in Roland Faber's book, God as Poet of the World, is a section on wisdom and spirit where he talks a lot about Sophia, and as a way he's it's very dense, and I need to reread it with a lot of focus, because he's talking about an aspect in which Sophia is like the primordial nature, and but he also equates it with the eros as both uh both immanent and transcendent. So anyway, there's quite a discussion, but though he doesn't necessarily say the divine feminine, he does bring Sophia into that conversation. So there's a little bit of a door there.
Very happy to know that. Could you say, I have several of his books, but I don't think the one you've mentioned. What's the title again?
It's called God as Poet of the World.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Hmm?
a few years old. It's
Yeah,
you know,
great.
yeah,
I'll,
2004. So it's been around a little bit. So that one you might find that section of
yeah,
interest.
I will. Yeah,
But
thank you.
you're right. It's most by and large, it's not been much of a point of discussion in the process world.